December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Before the light of dawn broke over the snow-crusted ridgelines of eastern Belgium, the earth itself began to tremble. Not from thunder, there was no storm that morning, only silence and a terrible cold that bit through wool and bone alike. The trembling came from iron, from 800 German tanks and assault guns rolling through the frozen dark, from nearly 200,000 Wehrmacht soldiers moving in coordinated columns through woods that the Allied High Command had declared impassable. They had called this sector a ghost front, a quiet seam in the line where tired divisions rested and green divisions trained. They were wrong. At 5:30 in the morning, in the gray pre-dawn of the Eifel Highlands, the German artillery opened. The sound rolled across 65 miles of front line like a wall of collapsing sky. American soldiers in their foxholes, many of them boys who had never heard that particular sound before, pressed themselves into the cold Belgian earth and tried to understand what was happening to them. What was happening was this. Adolf Hitler had gambled everything that remained of the Third Reich on a single audacious thrust through the Ardennes, west through Luxembourg and Belgium, northwest toward the port city of Antwerp, 200 miles away. His generals called the plan reckless. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the man whose name would be given to the offensive against his own wishes, called it purely visionary. He would later say that the forces committed were, in his exact words, much too weak for the task assigned. But Hitler was not listening to his generals. He had not been listening to his generals for years. The plan was called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Its target was not merely a port. Its deeper ambition was to split the British and American armies apart at their seam, to force a negotiated peace on the Western Front, and buy Germany time to deal with the Soviet juggernaut grinding relentlessly from the east. Hitler believed the Western Allies were fragile, that they lacked the will to absorb a catastrophic blow and continue fighting. He had underestimated them before. He was about to underestimate them again, more profoundly, more fatally than at any point in the war. At the center of this miscalculation stood a small Belgian market town of no particular beauty. Its peacetime population was 4,000 souls. It sat at the crossing of 7 roads, 7 major arteries that threaded through the densely wooded Ardennes highlands. German military planners called this convergence stray octopus, the road octopus, and they understood with cold professional precision what it meant. Whoever held Bastogne held the keys to the entire Ardennes road network. Without those roads, German armored columns could not spread, could not resupply, could not sustain their drive toward the Meuse River and beyond. Without Bastogne, the German offensive would eventually choke, starve, and freeze in the Belgian winter. Bastogne had to fall. The men tasked with holding it were the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, a force of 11,000 paratroopers who were not, strictly speaking, supposed to be there at all. They had been resting in Camp Mormel in France, recovering from the brutal fighting of Operation Market Garden. On the night of December 17th, they were roused, loaded onto trucks in the dark, and driven north into the sound of the guns. They arrived at Bastogne knowing almost nothing about what awaited them, without their full complement of ammunition, without adequate winter clothing, without sufficient medical supplies, and under a low ceiling of fog and cloud that grounded every Allied aircraft above them. By the afternoon of December 21st, all 7 roads leading into Bastogne had been cut. The encirclement was complete. The 101st Airborne was alone. The German commander tasked with reducing the Bastogne pocket was General Heinz Kokott of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. He looked at his maps, looked at his forces, and delivered what his headquarters considered a reasonable assessment. Bastogne would fall in days. The Americans were surrounded, outnumbered, undersupplied, and fighting in conditions that would break any army's endurance. On December 22nd, German officers approached the American perimeter under a flag of truce and delivered a formal written demand to the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. The note called upon him to surrender his forces, and it warned him with bureaucratic formality that if he refused, the annihilation of the encircled USA troops was the only remaining outcome. McAuliffe read the note. He set it down on a table. He thought for a moment. Then he wrote his reply, a single word, capitalized, followed by a period. Nuts. It was not merely defiance. It was a signal to Kokot, to the German High Command, to every man who would eventually read that note, that something was different about these Americans, something that no Wehrmacht battle plan had adequately accounted for. The 101st Airborne Division had been fighting on frozen ground, in foxholes scraped from the earth with bare hands, on dwindling rations and ammunition, in temperatures that plunged towards 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Their wounded lay in a church converted into a field hospital, treated with supplies that were nearly gone. Frostbite was spreading through the ranks. The artillery had been firing on rationed shells, a pitiful number per gun per day when men counted the rounds as they fired them. And yet not a single man of the 101st broke. Not a single position on the perimeter collapsed. There is an object that appears again and again in the accounts of those frozen days inside Bastogne. It is a K ration, a small cardboard box, standard issue, containing compressed biscuits, a small tin of processed meat, a few hard candies, a packet of powdered coffee, and a stick of chewing gum. To the men of the 101st, it represented the absolute outer edge of what they had. They rationed them, split them, sometimes ate them cold because fires would draw enemy fire. The K ration, this humble, mass-produced American box of survival food, assembled in factories in Chicago and Kansas City and shipped across an ocean, had become inside those frozen Belgian woods a kind of currency of endurance. Not abundance, not comfort, just enough to keep a man fighting for one more day. The German soldiers who occasionally captured American supplies looked at those boxes with a complicated mixture of hunger and awe. One German officer, examining captured American rations in the early days of the offensive, noted in a unit diary that American soldiers were being fed things that German soldiers had not seen since 1941. This was not a small observation. By December 1944, the average German infantryman in the Ardennes was surviving on black bread, thin soup, and ersatz coffee made from acorns. Their supply lines stretched back to railheads on the Rhine that Allied air power had bombed systematically and repeatedly for 6 months. They were cold in uniforms not designed for this winter. Their horses, yes horses, because the Wehrmacht still depended heavily on animal transport, were dying in the frozen mud. Meanwhile, on December 19, 1944, in the cold smoking rooms of the Caserne de Jardin-Fontaine in Verdun, France, the senior Allied commanders gathered in crisis. The room was filled with coats and cigars and the low urgent sound of men deciding the fate of a war. Among them was a man who had not yet spoken. He sat still in his chair, puffing a cigar, his face etched with something between concentration and barely contained energy. When Eisenhower turned to him and asked the question that everyone in the room was waiting for, "George, how long will it take you to turn your army north and attack?" Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr. did not hesitate. He said, 48 hours. The room fell silent for a moment. Then several officers laughed, openly, audibly. The idea was understood, by those who did not know Patton, to be the remark of a man either drunk with confidence or simply disconnected from military reality. To turn an entire field army, with its hundreds of thousands of men, its thousands of vehicles, its artillery trains and fuel convoys and supply depots, to disengage from one front, pivot 90 degrees north, advance over icy roads through freezing weather, and attack an entrenched German force, all in 48 hours, was not something that had ever been done in the history of modern warfare. The German High Command, when they eventually received intelligence of Patton's intentions, reportedly categorized the claim as operationally impossible. This was not arrogance. It was a military assessment grounded in every established doctrine of the time. Even by generous estimates, such a reorientation should have taken a minimum of a week. The German Army's own staff schools taught that armies needed time to disengage, time to regroup, time to shift supply lines, time to brief subordinate commanders, time to print new maps, Time for the 1,000 invisible administrative functions that hold a modern army together. The Wehrmacht understood military logistics with great professional sophistication. They simply did not understand that the army Patton commanded was not constrained by the same rules, because Patton had already started before the meeting ended. In the early morning hours of December 19th, while Patton was still preparing to leave for Verdun, he had summoned his corps commanders and handed them sealed contingency orders, orders he had drafted the night before, when the scope of the German offensive first became clear. 3 possible attack axes, codenamed cent, nickel, and dime. Before Eisenhower finished asking his question, Patton had already prepared his army for multiple possible answers. When Eisenhower accepted the nickel plan, the thrust toward Bastogne, Patton simply stepped to a telephone, called his chief of staff Hap Gay, and spoke a single word, nickel. The machinery was already in motion. On December 22nd, Patton's the 3rd Corps, led by the 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division, began their drive north. The roads were sheets of ice. The fields on either side were blanketed in snow. The temperature at night dropped to levels where tank engines froze, if not kept running, where brake fluid congealed, where the rubber seals on artillery hydraulics cracked and failed. American mechanics worked through those nights with bare hands on frozen metal, rebuilding what the cold broke, keeping Patton's armored column moving by force of discipline and industrial knowledge that no invading army in the world could have matched. On December 23rd, God, or something, answered Patton's prayer. He had commissioned his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, to compose a prayer for good weather, which Patton had printed on cards and distributed to every man of Third Army. The prayer asked the Almighty, with a kind of military directness, to restrain these immoderate rains and grant fair weather for battle. On December 23rd, the clouds broke. The sky over the Ardennes turned brilliant and cold and clear. And out of that sky came the answer that the Germans had feared more than any ground force. 241 American C-47 transport aircraft flew over besieged Bastogne in a formation that stretched across the horizon. German soldiers, looking up from their positions in the snow, watched this armada, with expressions recorded by their own officers, as something between shock and despair. The planes came in wave after wave, and from their bellies fell parachutes in a dozen colors: red for artillery shells, yellow for food, blue for medical supplies, white for clothing. The German besiegers watched 144 tons of American supplies falling like gifts from a sky they could not own. In their unit diaries, German officers noted the air resupply with a clinical detachment that barely concealed the psychological weight of what they had witnessed. This was the moment, not the relief itself, but this moment, when certain German commanders began to understand that they were not fighting a battle. They were fighting an economy. They were fighting factories in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio that had retooled in 18 months, from making automobiles and refrigerators to making tanks and artillery shells at a scale that the entire industrial output of the Reich could not match. They were fighting a country whose homeland had never been bombed, whose rail lines had never been cut, whose workers went home every night to houses with electricity and refrigerators and enough food that they could afford to buy war bonds with what was left over. Germany had gambled its final strategic reserve on one last offensive, and America had answered with 241 transport planes on a Tuesday afternoon in December. General Kokot's assessment shifted. In the days that followed, he would notify his superiors that further attacks against the Bastogne perimeter were becoming, in his words, irresponsible, a military term that carries an enormous weight when spoken by a general who has been ordered to take a position at all costs. He was not surrendering ideologically. He was surrendering to arithmetic. On December 26, 1944, at approximately 4:50 in the afternoon, a spearhead of the 4th Armored Division, tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a man who would one day give his name to America's main battle tank, pushed through the last German defensive line. Near the village of Assenois, the lead tank, nicknamed Cobra King, broke into the Bastogne perimeter and met the men of the 101st Airborne. The siege was over. 6 days after Patton had promised Eisenhower he would do the impossible, he had done it. The German reaction came in the days and weeks and years afterward, documented in interrogations, post-war memoirs, and the interviews conducted by the British military historian Basil Littlehart, who sat across from the surviving senior commanders of the Wehrmacht and asked them directly, why? Had they failed? Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had never wanted the Ardennes offensive and had predicted its failure from the beginning, gave Littlehart a remarkable answer. He did not speak first of Patton. He did not speak first of the 101st Airborne's resistance, though he acknowledged it. He spoke of 3 factors that had, in his estimation, made German defeat in the West inevitable. He named Allied air power. He named the destruction of German rail communications. And then he named something that is less often quoted, something that resonates with peculiar force when you know the full story of those December days. The sheer material weight of American industrial production. The capacity of the United States to replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them, to supply its armies with a volume and variety of equipment and food and medicine that German commanders found literally incredible when they captured American supply depots in the early hours of the offensive. SS Colonel Joachim Peiper, commanding the most powerful German armored spearhead of the entire offensive, captured American fuel at Hansfeld on the first day of the battle, 50,000 gallons of gasoline, and reportedly stood looking at those stores with the expression of a man who had just understood something he had been refusing to understand for a very long time. He had come into the American rear and found warehouses. He had come looking for a fragile Allied line and found the infrastructure of a continental economy. His own panzers had launched the offensive with barely enough fuel to reach their objectives if everything went perfectly. Here, at an American supply dump, in a small Belgian village, sat more fuel than some entire German divisions had been allocated for the operation. Peiper pressed on. He had no choice. The schedule was the schedule. But the look on his face, recorded in later accounts, was the look of a man revising an ideology in real time. This is what the German generals had not prepared for. Not Patton specifically. Not the 101st Airborne specifically. They had prepared for armies that followed predictable doctrinal constraints. They had prepared for enemies who would need a week to pivot, who would be delayed by weather and supply and organizational inertia. They had prepared for an enemy that resembled themselves, an army shaped by scarcity, moving carefully, rationing every decision. They had not prepared for an army shaped by abundance. An army where the supply officers were connected to an industrial machine of such scale and flexibility that even the plans that were made the night before could be executed the next morning with full logistical support. An army where chaplains wrote prayers for good weather, and those prayers were printed and distributed to 300,000 men before the ink was dry. In the years after the war, German officers who were asked about Patton's relief of Bastogne gave a range of answers. Some confined themselves to the tactical, describing his maneuver as skillful but explicable given the forces available. Others went deeper. General Blumentritt, von Rundstedt's chief of staff, said that the American capacity to execute at speed, not just plan at speed, but physically move and fight at speed, was something the Wehrmacht had never fully internalized as a capability. German military doctrine was built on depth, on careful preparation, on the principle that quality of planning multiplied quality of execution. American doctrine in the hands of commanders like Patton seemed to operate on a different principle entirely, that imperfect action delivered immediately was worth more than perfect action delivered late. The Germans called this recklessness. History called it victory. The 101st Airborne Division's casualties from December 19th to January 6th were 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. Patton's Third Army, in the drive to relieve them, sustained losses that the records document in careful columns of numbers that somehow still fail to convey the weight of individual lives. The town of Bastogne itself, bombarded for days, lost buildings and streets and the interior walls of houses where families had once eaten breakfast together before any of this began. And yet what emerged from those frozen days was something that cannot be measured in a casualty count. It was the moment when the German High Command, from von Rundstedt down to the brigade commanders watching 241 aircraft cross the sky above Bastogne, understood not merely that they were losing, but why. Not because of one general's audacity, though Patton's audacity was real and extraordinary. Not because of one division's courage, though the 101st courage was beyond what any training could have produced. But because the system behind those men, the factories, the highways, the organized labor, the supply depots, the military planning culture that allowed an army to pivot in 48 hours, the chaplains who wrote weather prayers, the mechanics who kept tank engines running at -20 degrees, the pilots who flew 241 aircraft through a break in the clouds, that system was the expression of something the German Reich had dismissed as bourgeois, as soft, as unworthy of a warrior nation. They called it democracy. They called it capitalism. They called it decadence. It had just punched a corridor through their finest encirclement and kept 11,000 paratroopers alive on K-rations and sheer American will. Long after the last snow of December 1944 melted into the Belgian earth, long after the last German armored column retreated east toward a river it would not be allowed to hold, a particular truth remained embedded in the ground at Bastogne, like the shell fragments that Belgian farmers still turn up in their fields today. It is a truth that has nothing to do with the romance of generals or the mythology of heroism, and everything to do with the deeper question of what sustains a free people in extremity. The answer, the one that broke the Ardennes offensive and confounded every German staff officer who tried to plan against it, was not a weapon. It was a box. A cardboard box, mass-produced by the millions, containing a few crackers, a tin of meat, a stick of gum, and enough calories to keep one soldier fighting for one more day. Multiplied by 11,000 men. Multiplied by 300,000 men in Patton's army. Multiplied by the factories and the farms and the free market and the democratic institutions that made the production of such boxes not a miracle, but simply a Tuesday. Freedom, it turned out, had excellent logistics, and General Patton had 48 hours.